So thanks for the lovely introduction, Anna, and thanks to everybody for having me back. It's really wonderful to be back in London, back in the IEDE. I left, like many people, very suddenly in March 2020. When UCL gave the working from home directive, I took that quite literally and got on one of the last flights that landed in Australia before the borders closed, and managed to make my way back to Western Australia, where I worked from home for a year before changing jobs and moving to Melbourne. So I'm now, and part of it was a very difficult decision for me to leave UCL and to leave London and all the really wonderful work that we've been doing here, particularly with community groups in London, and to make the transition to Melbourne, which is a city that I'd never lived in before, and it is on the other side of a very large continent from where my family are in Western Australia. But the reason why I made the decision to take the job was because it is a really unique role. It's a really interesting opportunity, and what really attracted me to move to Melbourne was this role as City of Melbourne Chair. So what that means is that City of Melbourne part sponsor my role in the university. I have a full research professor role, so I'm a fully autonomous academic with everything that that entails. But the idea of the partnership is that my work is that you know, the kind of hope or the leap of faith that the city takes is that my research aligns with what their priorities are, and you know, that's loosely under the heading of urban resilience and innovation. So that opportunity to really work in partnership with local government, really from the outset across the boundaries of the institutions, was part of the attraction of the job, and the reason why I made the very difficult decision to leave UCL and, you know, all of your lovely faces and all of the great work that we have been doing here over many years. So today I'm going to just talk to you a bit about some of that early work that we've been able to do. That's not going to work. Interesting. I don't know. Oh, good. Thank you, Anna. That was very profound informative. You had this. So I'm going to just talk a little bit more, and you may have noticed that that was an Australian thing. I didn't used to say that when I said, did I? I'm going to talk about the City of Melbourne Partnership, and then what's really been our first piece of work coming out of that at the end of last year, which was an urban resilience framework for local government, and a bit about the background theory of resilience that, you know, informs that. Resilience is something that has been talked about in academic and government and industry circles for a good couple of decades now, so we're certainly not announcing anything new here, but we were really refreshing and taking a look at what does resilience mean, particularly at that, you know, there was, well, perhaps we're still in that moment of, you know, now that we've been through the pandemic, we thought in 2021, and, you know, so particularly through that pandemic experience, we'll then give some sense of a flavour of what that looks like in one of the council's major initiatives, which is around community disaster preparedness. And then also about some of the thinking that we're currently doing about how our resilience framework aligns or not with the Sustainable Development Goals, because the City of Melbourne is one of the local governments that have signed up to what's called the New York Declaration to localise the Sustainable Development Goals. I think something that I didn't mention previously is that you'll notice I do have co-authors listed there, so the work that I'm presenting is not just my own. It's also Melanie Lowe, who works with me as a postdoc, and Alyssa McMillan, Marie Granville and David Sweeting are from the City of Melbourne. They're part of the City Resilience and Sustainable Futures team there. And the other thing at the outset to acknowledge is that the City of Melbourne is the current government on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. They're the traditional owners of that country. And as someone who works there, where all of this work was done, I acknowledge their elders, past and present, and that those people have been taking care of that country and have proven to be extraordinarily resilient over many thousands of generations. And the other thing that I now realise, the slide that is missing here, is about the City of Melbourne. So the City of Melbourne is a central municipality within a broader metropolitan area of Melbourne. So the City of Melbourne would be the equivalent here of the London Borough of Camden. It's the borough that, or it's the municipalities where the university is based, but it only governs a small part of the city. One key difference between Melbourne and London is that there is no equivalent of the Greater London Authority. There's no municipal government, no metropolitan government. And so that does make things a bit tricky when you're thinking about resilience, because what I'm talking about today is only a very small part of a bigger metropolitan region. The other thing to note in terms of context for Australia is that there's local government, like here is the level of government closest to local communities. There's the federal government, which is the national government, and then the states are the kind of intermediary regional governments in between. So this is at the lowest level of government, and I would say on average that local governments in Australia have fewer powers than they do here, but that they are, and it's not uncommon in planning, I guess, as happens here a bit, for state governments to come in and overrule planning decisions by local governments in strategically important projects. But I would also say that they have more autonomy over their own budget controls. So local government isn't as vulnerable as in Australia as they are here to the kind of austerity cuts that have been seen here in recent decades. So the partnership between the City of Melbourne and the University of Melbourne really was established back in around 2015. There was this proposal from the university to the city to sponsor a chair. In its early days, that was intended to be around something to do with urban sustainability. Then an opportunity came along for Melbourne, the City of Melbourne, to join the Rockefeller Foundation funded Resilient Cities 100 network. So the Rockefeller Foundation were funding work across a number of cities to really push this urban resilience agenda, and Melbourne was one of those that was chosen as one of the first cohort. London is another one. And so that gave them some funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, which they used to establish a Resilient Melbourne office, which at that point actually tried to deal with all of metropolitan Melbourne, and also provided an opportunity to just redirect the chair position to focus on resilience. So someone called Lars Kernan was in the chair before me for 2 or 3 years, and he returned with his family to Europe. The post opened up again and I applied and was thankfully successful in being appointed, and I started work in February 2021. So on a day-to-day basis, so there's this general oversight and a reasonable amount of interest from the councillors, the people who are elected, to make sure that this investment from the city into the university is actually bearing fruit for the ratepayers of Melbourne. And on a day-to-day basis, that means, or probably a week-to-week basis, that means that I work very closely with the City Resilience and Sustainable Futures team. They sit within the Climate Change and City Resilience branch. And then we also have a formal steering committee that meets every 6 months, and then a more informal forum that meets every couple of months that enables me and my team to have access to offices across the city, across the council operations. So, and one of the very first things when we first started having these what are now regular kind of catch-ups with the team in the city, and the other thing that happened in 2020 was that the Rockefeller Foundation funding ended. So the Resilient Melbourne, which was an effort to try and look at resilience across the metropolitan region, came to an end, and that team was really absorbed back into just the City of Melbourne, the smaller metropolitan area. So that team in early 2021, I'd just arrived. They'd also just been through a bit of a reorganisation. And so they were wanting to say, all right, what do we, as we all start out together, what do we mean by resilience? And just as a way of, we're having a workshop to talk more about working with local government on Thursday. But from that very early conversation, we had a workshop together. That workshop was at the university, so it created a nice space for the city folks to get out of their offices and to engage in a bit of kind of bigger picture thinking, which they often don't have space to do, to look back over the work that they brought with them from Resilient Melbourne and the Resilient Cities 100 network, to think about where they are now, how resilience relates to sustainable development in particular, which has a very strong resonance within the City of Melbourne. And so, yeah, what does resilience look like for Melbourne, for local government now? So we continued that process of having a series of workshops. We did a big review of the literature, very standard kind of, academic process. And the outputs were a 5,000 word issues paper, which it's now under peer review for a journal, and shorter briefing papers for, busy councillors and others. And we're looking to apply it across different projects, and we'll give you a bit of a flavour of that. We also reported this work at the main cities conference in Australia as kind of co-authors. So that's something else that we've been establishing, is just a pattern of co-authorship and collaboration with partners in the city. So I guess we'll now, start off on what is resilience? And I'm sure many of you have heard of that word before. So does anyone want to shout out what they think resilience is? And it sure is a word we've heard a lot of in the last couple of years. Yeah, or a disruption. Yeah. That's the right answer. Yeah. Yeah, anyone else want to add anything to that? That's a pretty good answer. So we think about resilience in this bounce back kind of context, and we've certainly heard a lot of bouncing back better. And we also know that resilience is a word that we talk about. It comes from many different academic and professional disciplines. So there's the idea of, personal resilience from psychology. Resilience is a characteristic that we want to instill in children, in child development. It's something that comes from ecology, it comes from engineering, it comes from all sorts of systems thinking kinds of areas. So these next few kind of slides were just some of the background that the City Resilience team presented as their previous kind of work and thinking about that underpins their work in resilience. And it comes from, some of this comes from this Rockefeller Foundation 100 Resilient Cities network, which is still active, but in a different kind of way than it was in the main push of that. So the reason why the Rockefeller Foundation and the Resilient Cities 100 network was really wanting to push resilience was in some ways, you know, to improve how we might be ready for major disasters like a pandemic. But these are some of the kind of big trends that have been happening over the last couple of decades. Clearly, cities have been globalising and have been more interconnected. Perhaps we're starting to see some of these things rolling back. Increasing density in population and urbanisation. Again, the pandemic has seen, you know, lots of movements of people moving out to smaller cities and to rural locations. Climate change absolutely has not gone away. And other trends around the rise of digital technologies, increasing complexity and interconnection of systems and cities, and, you know, rapid and growing or increasing rates of change. And when we're talking about resilience, we need to think about resilience to what? What are we responding to? And we're responding to, yes, those acute shocks, so an earthquake or an act of terror. And we're also responding to chronic stresses, so some of those underlying long-range climate trends, underlying trends like poverty and inequality, unemployment, some of those deeper stresses that undermine an ability of a system to maintain its function. And clearly, as that previous point about complexity is that these things are interrelated and interact and magnify each other and amplify stresses and shocks. So this is actually quite an old, you know, we could have easily updated this from the news today, but certainly from a few weeks ago, is that a city might have, as London has recently had, an extreme shock like a heat wave that then leads to fires and other cascading water shortages, other cascading problems. But heat then amplifies underlying stresses like inequality, which lead to overcrowding in housing. And of course, we saw that, you know, more than evidently during the pandemic, that, you know, communities that were most vulnerable to COVID-19 were those that were already dealing with poverty, inequality, housing stress, and so on. So those are some of the things that we're trying to prepare for, we're trying to be able to respond to. And so resilience theory then draws on different understandings or different system sciences, really. So there's an ecological, or what sometimes is also called an engineering perspective, which is this classic bounce back. So can systems absorb stresses, and when they are disrupted, can they bounce back, recover from their back to their previous state and function? Then more recently, a socio-ecological systems perspective says, can systems learn in that process as well, so that it's not just about recovery? And then a more evolutionary perspective, which we've drawn on, then says also, can a system through that process evolve to a better place than where we started, so that bouncing back better. And another important element of thinking about resilience and, you know, resilience theory is, what do we want to be resilient? What is it? So we've kind of looked a bit at resilient to what, the shocks and the stresses. Resilience of what is really, you know, urban systems in all sorts of ways, but resilience of or for whom. So there are lots of things that are proving to be highly resilient, like structural racism, that we might not want to. We might want to undermine the resilience of some of those systems. Whereas other things might prove to be quite fragile, like political consensus or some of our climate responses. So we do have to be quite cautious that, you know, resilience is not an entirely neutral concept. You know, we need to also, and this is when we're thinking about what do we want to build back to or what do we want to bounce back to, is where possible we want to build out some of those structural inequalities or some of those other chronic stresses that might have been already undermining the sustainability and the equity and, in fact, the resilience of the system to start with. So in our framework that we developed with the city, we were working from this evolutionary bounce forward idea. They were very keen on this word transformative, to think about how processes might actually transform the systems and social structures of the City of Melbourne, and to conceptualise resilience as a process, as an ongoing process, with sustainable development as the destination. So the sustainable development goals are very outcome focused, and sustainable development is a kind of state that we want to get to, and resilience is what keeps you on the pathway to achieving that. And in developing our framework, as I said, there's enormous amounts of work already being done, so we're very much synthesising and building on what's already out there. And this very long sentence is what we agreed as the definition of resilience for local government for the City of Melbourne. And it's a capacity of institutions, communities, individuals, businesses and systems within a city to adapt, survive and thrive, no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks are experienced, and to positively transform as a result. So the definition is a little bit kind of definition by committee, but it's looking to address, you know, a range of different stakeholders in the city and to align with the kind of underlying commitment to sustainable development at the city. So then we've got this, you know, that's a very worthy definition. And then the next step is to say it's quite hard to operationalise something like that. So then what are the qualities of resilience? How might you know resilience if you saw it? So does anyone want to shout out some words that might be qualities of resilience? What would a resilient system look like if you wanted to build it? Over-engineered. Well, hopefully not. No. Sorry? Adaptable, that's a good word. Sustainable, yeah. Inclusive, yes, very good. Any other more systems thinking kinds of things? You know, what do we, when we talk about, yeah, structural, and what kinds of elements of structure might you see? Yeah, learning is one. Yeah. So here are some, here's the answer. So we took that definition, we then said, here are some characteristics of a resilient city or of resilience. Resilience has to deal with something about persistence. If you want your basic functions to keep on keeping on, it's able to recover under shocks and stresses. It has a capacity to adapt, and it has the capacity to transform. Those were the four things that four headline characteristics. And then we've got these 10 qualities of resilient cities. So there's something there about reflective, or, you know, is able to learn. I think there was Inclusive was one. Innovative, maybe it's not quite over engineering, but we know the ability not just to innovate around technologies, but to experiment, test ideas. Yeah, and a whole bunch of different, so well, those 10 characteristics were what we came to, partly by adapting what the Resilient Cities 100 network and others have already had already worked on, to update them and to make them more relevant to the city as it stands. So then, in terms of how this might start to be applied, so another element within the City of Melbourne's 4-year plan, they have a series of major initiatives. So these are projects that the council undertakes over those 4 years. They have a budget to support them, and there are 52 of those initiatives, I believe, because major initiative 52 was the one that kind of made it in under the door as it was coming down, and relates to community disaster preparedness and community disaster resilience. I think this is going to be called the headline for this is going to be called Prepare Melbourne, will be the kind of marketing headline for it. And this is, again, one of the kind of learnings from not just the pandemic, but Melbourne had also responded to some storms in February 2020. Australia as a whole was and still is recovering from those horrendous bushfires of 2019 and 20. And for Melbourne, that had a big air quality knock-on effect. And Melbourne, like London, is dealing with much more extreme heat and heat waves in the summers. Also, even just in the last 2 years, although it's even less than that since I've been there, Melbourne has had, really serious storms last year. So yeah, a range of, there was even an earthquake in Melbourne. And there was some quite scary civil unrest at one point associated with lockdowns. So there are lots of things that, and the experience of the pandemic has been, and for many of those, is that local communities are essential in responding to those, and have shown great resilience and great capacity to respond, but often without very much support and often without very much preparation. So it's about recognising, instead of just celebrating the great resilience and communities pulling together to help each other out under extreme circumstances, is, well, how can we actually support people so that firstly they might contribute to avoiding some of those avoiding some of those disasters, but how do we better support them so that that response is more effective and more integrated with emergency services. It's a curious, emergency response is a curious thing for a local government, I think, even here, to be involved in, because it's not necessarily something that is designated within their powers. It's, and we did see this in the pandemic, this argument over what is the role of for local government versus national government in relief efforts, that kind of thing. And I think this is an example where the City of Melbourne identified a gap that needs to be filled. None of the major disaster agencies, they're all doing their kind of little bits, but as that layer of government closest to communities, there is a role for local government to, if nothing else, facilitate and coordinate some of those efforts, but also to just simply work with their communities and constituents. And it's also based on recognising that they've started to do some surveys and realise that there's actually very low levels of awareness within people in their municipality of, well, self-reported lack of preparedness, and low levels of awareness of the kind of systems and support that they already do have in place. So they really want to figure out how can they work better with communities, grassroots communities, to improve their disaster resilience. So just thinking through what might our framework mean, I'm not going to go through all 10 of those qualities, but this is the kind of way that as they're framing a major 4-year program like that, they can start to think, all right, so how do we think about community disaster preparedness in an integrated way? And so obviously we need to think about all of these integrated shocks and stresses. We also want to think about how we're integrating with other emergency response agencies so that the fire service and Emergency Management Victoria and police and others are involved in these initiatives. How do we, well, the entire effort here is about preparedness. And one of the things that, the other big disaster that's happened in Australia recently are major floods. And again, this comes up that governments and emergency responders not always as effectively and as quickly as are needed, but they arrive to deal with a disaster. There's some effort at helping recovery. There's all sorts of promises made. And then eventually communities are left to manage not just trauma, but rebuilding and, economic recovery and so on. And then that's where it ends. There's very little coming in beforehand to prepare and to avoid disasters. So this is really wanting to think about that preparedness element. And thinking about extreme heat in Melbourne, one of the things in their responses and getting this communities engaged in some of these programs is to have multiple responses. So not just to, mandate air conditioning in public buildings, for instance, which would potentially be a counter effective, would be in the opposite direction of climate change mitigation, but to provide, in this case, information about routes that people can walk through the city that are cooler than walking in a concrete sun-baked thoroughfare, places just to hang out. So that might be letting people know that there's air conditioning in the library, or that there's a particularly, nice shady park that they can go to. And the Arts House Refuge was a 6-year arts-based program to engage communities around responses and to engage community arts practitioners as well. So looking at diverse kind of stakeholders and programs. And some of the sort of tech innovation is about putting sensors around the city so that you can know which are the cooler routes and which are the cooler places. You can get ideas about where the urban heat island is most intense. Looking at how might they promote green infrastructure, and which has known benefits to reduce urban heat island effect. And that's both some things like trialling green tram tracks, but also the Green Factor tool, which is a tool for planners to get to analyse and to get more green infrastructure into new developments. So yeah, this is just another reminder of how that whole, our resilience framework and our current piece of work that we have ongoing at the moment. So I mentioned that the City of Melbourne has signed up to voluntary local review of the Sustainable Development Goals. So they're using that really as their kind of overarching framing of reporting progress across their plan and all of their activities and operations. So that in itself has been a really vast program of work which City of Melbourne, which University of Melbourne and Monash University helped them with. But we're now saying, so they've kind of aligned all of their indicators and measurements to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the council has signed on with that. So that's kind of how everything's being reported in the City of Melbourne at the moment. We then also want to get resilience in there, but we're not, it's unlikely that they're also going to go, oh yes, and now, so here is our Sustainable Development Goals report, and on top of that, we've got a resilience. That's not going to happen. So what we're looking at is how can we, or how already is resilience embedded in some of those sustainable development measures, and if there are some bits that are missing, how might that be addressed? Oh. So this goes back to this question about what's the relationship between resilience and sustainable development, and this idea that resilience is a process that gets you to sustainable development, and but sustainable development is measuring the outcomes that you want to achieve. Now it's some very easy, obvious connections or intersections in that Goal 9 is specifically about resilient infrastructures, and Goal 11 also is specifically about resilient cities. So there's some, hope that this might not be a fool's errand. And so this is the, if you're interested, there's the link to the City of Melbourne's, nice weighty tome of hundreds of indicators that map back to those goals. And it's a non-trivial exercise to do this because they're global goals. They were written for, national level targets that don't necessarily make sense to a local government. So there's been quite a lot of effort to get that alignment right. And so what we're doing is sort of starting with that document, which they've done their first round of reporting, and they'll repeat this every 4 or 5 years, along with when they update their council plan. So we're at this stage looking at which of those indicators might we also use as a means of looking at what resilience is. Is your system resilient? One of the challenges is this output process kind of dichotomy, that resilience is mostly a process and mostly sustainable development reports outcomes. But there are some things like diversity and inclusion that cross over on both of those. So there are some things that we'll be able to kind of pull out and say, this will give you also some indication of, as a whole, is Melbourne resilient as well as sustainable? And we will also then be able to say, are there other things that you might do that might be more holistic, might be more qualitative, to also keep a track on resilience as you go? How might those qualities be translating into the operations, the plans, the services of the City of Melbourne? So just to finish up there, I think, we started with the shocks and stresses and the wicked problems that resilience is trying to respond to at both a global level, and then bringing that down to a city and even down to a municipality level, that there are these interconnected systems and cascading shocks and stresses. And wherever you are in the world, there's always unclear and fragmented governance of some form or other. And so there's always a role for the, most connected or most local form of government. And part of the, experience of working with those complex interconnected systems is that no one agency, no one government can really control and manage all of them. So everybody needs to work in partnership, including partnerships with universities. And so that's what we're really trying to model in our partnership, is in this work that we do, is how might you work together as partners? How might we make our own way of working resilient? And, and that has to be founded on a strong working relationship. So I think we'll share, and yeah, that's it. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you so much, Sarah.